Because this is an air shock video with air springs, it's incredibly important for you to note that I am 200 pounds, 100 kilograms, so on the heavier side with an intermediate skill level. I like to surf, kite surf, windsurf, and basically surf jib down the trail, and there's no racing involved, so take everything with a grain of salt. Now this video was delayed like 6 months because I was trying to get a hold of an EXT area. So this shock has a double air chamber system, plus and plus plus. So it's very likely this is the best air shock in the market, but it's not exceptionally popular or well known. So I'm just going to go ahead and make the video and put the Ohlins into #1 best place. So I'm going to be ranking these from best to worst. There is 2 different Ohlins air shocks. We have the TTX1, which according to Ohlins, you're going to want to use this on a more linear suspension type. Then we have TTX2. That is for more progressive bikes. So my 2 cents here, always go for the larger volume air can. It's going to give you a substantially better ride. Ohlins understands suspension the best. This is a all-mountain, smaller air shock. It is not a massive air shock like the Rockshox Vivid we'll jump into later. So we do have 1 position high-speed compression. But never underestimate the power of simplicity, because Ohlins make stuff basically turnkey high performance, something that Rockshox will get to in about 2030. This big old knob here, we have #1 is fully open high speed compression, #2 is the only adjustment of high speed compression you get, and #3 is like a pedaling platform, but this is not a lockout. This is just a firmed up mode that you can pedal on very efficiently on the trail. Keeping with simple and high performance, we have 10 clicks of low speed compression, so just put 5 clicks on this and never think about it again. Ohlins doesn't fall for the marketing trap of parking lot damping, so it's hard to feel the adjusters when you're in the parking lot and you move them all the way firm and all the way open. Parking lot damping is when you move the low speed compression and you can push down on the parking lot and feel a difference. We do not want to feel this if you want the highest level performance. Now this shock is pretty light at 500 grams. The only thing that's going to come in your box is a whole bunch of Lego blocks. And these look like volume reducers and stroke reducers, and unfortunately you need a bottom bracket tool to open this shock up, so I didn't even bother. So not even Ohlins is immune to air shock bullshit. So essentially the shock is topping out. And what usually happens is you didn't inflate the shock correctly and the negative chamber didn't get filled up, and it'll give you this horrible clunk. And there's absolutely no useful information in the user manual. So what you need to do is basically look on Reddit or find some idiot on YouTube like myself who's solved this problem. So this is the shock with the compression, the high-speed compression in the full open setting. So it's definitely a bobber. Bob, bob, bob. So this doesn't really matter if you're on an e-bike, but if you're on an Amish bike, it's pretty important to have a climb lever. So let's take a look at this Ohlins air shock in #3, basically the climb mode. It is not fully locked out, but it's definitely super firm. Okay, so there's not much adjustment period. The stuff just works really good, but you do have to have the shock and the fork. I spent a couple weeks on that fork, put a couple different shocks on it, and could not get it right. Putting the Ohlins air shock into the mix, everything was absolutely dialed within like 20 minutes. There's no massive adjustment period, like jumping over from a Fox to a Rockshox. The Ohlins TTX air shock experience is one of a kind. Basically the ramp up was absolutely perfectly dialed straight out of the box. Every single other air shock I've ever used, it took like 2 to 3 openings of the air shock and adding tokens in. So while I was doing my little YouTube research, I watched this guy's video, and this shock comes with a whole bunch of spacers in it from the factory. Every other brand on the market should be doing this as well, because they basically got the ramp up absolutely dialed for my super progressive frame. So I did discover one unique thing that happened during that ride. Basically the top out condition that was happening before the ride was completely fixed, and the pressure went from 270 down to 240. So I went back out to the test track, with 270 in the shock, and the experience was absolutely rubbish. So I actually liked the way it rode better with like 40% sag and lower pressure. Heading into some more chunky trails, let's see how that TTX2 does. Is it an Enduro Champ or an all-mountain princess? But the damping performance out of the TTX2 is really good. And there is some benefits of riding an air shock. They do kind of stand up in their travel, making your bottom bracket substantially taller over those chunky, rocky, rooty sections, with the compromise of slipping out all over the trail. After half a mile or so of technical descending, the TTX2 is good and it's bad. While it has this perfect built-in ramp up with the factory tokens installed, it is missing that jumpy jibby factor that I love from certain air shocks, and this one does not have the secret sauce, but it is a pretty impressive shock when you look at it from 10,000 feet above. After a couple weeks of riding the team suspension, the Ohlins TTX2 air shock, and the Ohlins 38 air fork, I was not sold. This is not going to go into the backup quiver, it's going to go on to Pink Bike Classified. The TTX air shock is really going to match your Ohlins 36 air shock. I think this would be like the perfect suspension for your specialized Levo. But let's jump into the spreadsheet and find out the real dirt on this guy. So there is 35 total points from my categories here, and the Ohlins TTX2 air shock comes in at 35 points, a perfect score. The same as the forks and same as the coil shocks. So personally, I don't want to own this air shock or the fork. So even though I'm saying this is the best, I don't want to own it. So just try to pick your favorite from the video. The TTX2 air shock cool factor is definitely 5 stars. When I see this, it impresses me. And that's the only thing cool suspension is going to do, is impress some nerd on the trail. The reason I put this into #1 place personally is because the setup is incredibly easy with one click of very effective high-speed compression and the tokens built in from the factory. This is 5-star suspension because you can go 36 or 38, but I would say the 36 is definitely the better fit for this all-mountain princess. When it comes to air shocks, it's 5 stars. The air spring, I'm going to give it 4 stars because it does have some equalization issues. I am on the top end of the weight for this shock. It does not work very good in my opinion above 250 psi. A lot of the ways I can ride these air shocks, the only way I can ride these air shocks because of my heavy 220 pound weight, is I'm running mullet bikes with a 29 in the rear with like 40% sag because I don't like to go above 250 psi. The chassis on the Ohlins is definitely 5 stars with its stubby piggyback. It will fit into almost every single bike, and the damping from Ohlins is always 5 stars. So to put some clarity in why I would not want to own the TTX2 air shock, it is not very good for 200-pound riders. I had to go to 250 psi, which is like 40% sag, and the shock is not particularly jibby and playful. So #2 on the list is the least cool but the best performing. Manitou is the most underrated suspension brand on the entire market, but you're gonna have to get over a few things that I will cover later in this video. They like to do things completely backwards, and this is not a good thing. Why would you mark the compression red? To confuse people? Let's get on past that. To reinforce what I said in the first part of the Ohlins video, maximum pressure 250 psi. Regardless of what the manufacturer says, do not go above 250 psi if you want the best performance. The Fox Float X2 has a 32mm shaft, while that thin pencil shaft on the Mara Pro comes in about 28mm. So which kind of shaft do you like best? Well, let's get past that before I offend more people. Now the build quality on Manitou kind of reminds me of an Erector set or a Lego set, but it's definitely pretty high quality. We have a pretty cool lever here, work and party. So remember from the Ohlins shock, simplicity is the best. Mark everything and make it simple, guys. There's only a few brands on the market that require you to inflate the piggyback pressure. So this is a very powerful tool. You can actually tune how the shock feels, higher pressure, stiffer shock. Now, you may think that's a complete pain in the ass, but after checking like 80 different shocks on the market, they're always low. So it's a good idea to be always checking these. Getting the Mara Pro bolted into my bike and inflating it with air, I was absolutely shocked. I think I only require like 180 PSI to get the right amount of sag. So this has never happened to me ever. And remember, I didn't put any tokens in this thing, and it was, I do believe, was brand new. So right away, this is definitely the most impressive air can on the entire list. Now they call it the King Kong air can or something. And it looks like Fox has basically copied this with the Genie platform, and this is nothing new. Manitou invents it, and then all the brands copy it 5 years later. Precise timing for this shock. First impression of the Mara Pro, truly impressive. But there's a couple bad things here. We have unmarked compression. I can't even remember which one is high and low speed compression, but they do have pretty excellent setup manuals on their website. The first test run on the Mara Pro. But right away, this shock sticks out to me as incredibly sensitive to riders' input. And once again, we have an untraditional internal floating piston with a soft feel to it. It's like the equivalent of a bladder inside of the piggyback. Now the super tech level nerds absolutely hate me for saying that bladders are better, but I don't even know if those guys ride their bike. These non-traditional internal floating pistons and bladders in the piggyback are far superior. Secret sauce ingredient 1 out of 2 is a soft internal floating piston like in the Manitou Mara, or a bladder inside of the piggyback. So many people will get very angry with me and say there's no difference in the dyno data. But remember, we ride bikes on the trail, not in the laboratory. So these tech nerds need to go do a back-to-back test, and I will be making a video on that shortly. Just because the Mara Pro has a soft internal floating piston, that does not automatically mean it's good. You also have to have a good damper and a couple more secret sauces. Because there's a bladder shock in here, I rank way down the list. I'm here to provide you the full picture here, so everything is a compromise. Even though this thing is incredibly active, it can actually make you crash because the damper is so active. So it's perfect for my ADD surfer style down the trail, but I almost crashed. So this is a simple fix. We're just going to play around with the air pressure and the compression to calm the shock down. Now there's one caveat to the Manitou, and it's amazing air spring. Once again, this thing is incredibly sensitive to air pressure. But when you're dealing with these small companies like Manitou, the setup guide says 1 to 3 PSI when you're doing the adjustment. So you better have a digital shock pump. Once I got that all dialed in, this is the best air shock I've ever rode. Now personally, this is 100% personal, I think it is the ugliest air shock I've ever seen. It looks like a elephant trunk with tribal stickers on it. Remember, being cool on the trail is pretty important to us dudes, I do believe. So I definitely read some stuff from Manitou saying this thing is incredibly easy to tune the shim stacks at home. So you're gonna have to spend like $300 of tools to crack this thing open, but there is such a diehard allegiance, there's some aftermarket tools available. I only got to like the first air can and then basically gave up and wasn't gonna do a reshim. I do appreciate them providing the repair manuals, and the air can has tokens in it from the factory, so that's why it's in number 2 place. The setup on this guy is pretty simple, not having to open the shock up. The Manitou Mara. So I've been editing for a couple hours. I'm going to add a category in here, but not put them into the total point scores because it may not be important to you. It's the only thing that's important to me. The otter play factor. So the Ohlins gets 3 stars in that department. The Manitou Mara Pro. I'm giving this 1 stars for the cool factor because I don't think it's very cool. The setup is 6 stars. It is truly incredibly easy to set up if you have a digital shock pump. The package suspension of Manitou, the Mezzer is kind of a love it or hate it fork. It's not for everyone. It is a good fork, so I'm just going to give this 4 stars. The performance of the Mara Pro is absolutely outstanding with a 6-star rating. and it is extremely friendly to heavyweight riders. No other shock on this list is friendly to heavyweight riders. The air spring is 5 stars because it's friendly to heavyweight riders. The chassis, I'm going to give it 3 stars because it looks stupid, but it does function good. The damping is 5 stars. It's not the best, but it's definitely very good, and I can't find any reason to downgrade it off 5. Coming in with a total point score of 30, just the cool factor holding the Mara out of first place. Now this is a shock I would own because the otter play factor is 6. This thing likes to dance, jib, and move around the trail. So let's move into the people's shock, the Rockshox Vivid Ultimate. The Vivid is a truly massive shock in your hand with a whopping 34mm stanchion, making LeBron James a little bit jealous. So when we look at the X2, if you watch the first part of the video, it's 32mm. But remember, size doesn't matter. It's always the motion of the ocean. So let's peel off that air can foreskin and put some tokens in her. That was the script from the first video. Hopefully that was funny. So we're gonna go off script. Now the first experience with the Rockshox Vivid was very challenging. So when these shocks are brand new, they don't have the instructions out quite yet. So I kind of had to battle through this and figure it out. So if you get a non-specific Rockshox Vivid, it comes with 0 tokens installed. On a positive note, the sag indicators, while they may be full 100% peasant status and make you look like a barn dog, they will absolutely make your life easy, and I would take these on any one of my shocks without a heartbeat. So I did read something that Rockshox has some kind of patent on them, and maybe that's why they're only on Rockshox products. The massive size of the Rockshox Vivid presents some serious fitment issues. So this is my 2021 Specialized Kenevo. One cycle of this shock gouged the frame and the shock. So I put some stickers on it and was like, let's send it, and hopefully I don't blow the frame up. Filling the Rockshox Vivid up is absolutely an utter nightmare. You have to cycle this shock 40% of the travel every 50 psi or you'll get a horrendous top out, and then you should expect some weird hissing noise coming out of this shock. So there are some failures occurring with this shock, mostly due to the air can. It's not cavitated because basically it has additional performance, it has some additional problems and headaches. Taking this out for its first ride, I bought the marketing hook, line, and sinker, baby. They told me this was going to be a coil shock, and I knew within like 5 minutes this was just a very active air shock, requiring you or wanting you to turn the climb switch on. The touchdown technology just basically bypasses the compression circuit, so this thing is very active. First huck into the chunk, I was like, this is no coil shock. I knew this was just going to be an upgrade from my previous Super Deluxe, but nothing special. It is very friendly when it comes down to all the adjusters because the rebound knob pulls off and you can move them around nice and easy. When you have the high speed or the hydraulic bottom out maxed out, it makes this wicked cool noise when you bottom out. The Vivid is incredibly sensitive to air pressure, and if you get an off-the-shelf version that's not specific to your bike, without the tokens installed, the setup period is incredibly challenging because you have so many adjustments. High-speed compression, hydraulic bottom out, low-speed compression, tokens, and rebound. So it is pretty impressive if you can get it dialed on those blue flow trails. Debriefing on the Rockshox Vivid Ultimate. So the cool factor is definitely 5 stars because it is new, but there's nothing really special about it, I'm gonna say. When it comes to the setup, this is a bit of a mixed bag. If you get the Bike Pacific Rockshox Vivid, it could be substantially easier because it comes with all the adjusters moved and it has tokens inside of it. The shock I had was an off-the-shelf, no-tune one, and it was extremely difficult, super touchy to air pressure and tokens, so I'm only going to give this 3 stars. So remember, everything's kind of a trade-off. The Vivid Ultimate is incredibly better shock than the first generation Super Deluxe, but then this one is a little bit harder to set up. So your hard setup, more performance. Easy setup, no performance. Most of the time, unless you're up at the top. When it comes to package suspension, it's definitely 6 stars. because you could be one of those idiots with a lyric on your bike and this massive downhill rated shock. The performance is, I'm gonna give 4 stars, middle of the road. Definitely a 5-star rating when you're like pounding on blue flow trails. But when you take this in the chunk, it just doesn't have the traction of a coil shock. I don't understand the marketing behind that. So the air spring, it's 4 stars because most of you guys probably aren't 220 pounds. But I actually traded my friend Super Deluxe Ultimate for the Vivid. So he got the Vivid and he was 240 and he couldn't ride the shock. You cannot take this shock over 280 psi. I remember the golden rule is 250. So not friendly to heavyweight riders, so it's going to get a little bit of a downgrade on the air spring department, even though I actually like the Vivid because it has a pretty good otter play factor rating. We're going to give this 5 stars. The chassis on this is 4 stars because there's some serious fitment issues when you build a shock this large. There's a lot of bikes that's not going to fit on. The damper is super primitive, but Rockshox is super forward thinking, adding hydraulic bottom out to all their shocks. This is an amazing touch, but we're still giving it 3 stars. So the otter play score is 5 stars because this thing is incredibly fun on blue flow trails, but it's not very friendly to the heavyweight riders, so I personally don't own one. The 2024 Warranty Edition Fox Float X2. According to Fox's website, we have a lot of reliability updates inside. While it retains the same exact chassis and feels exactly the same during the unboxing period and has the precise same amount of clickers, it is a wildly different shock. Whenever installing a new X2, make sure the air valve does not contact your frame. You can ask me how I learned that the hard way. The first ride on the new Warranty Edition 2024 Fox Float X2 was instantly weird. I was like, the fork feels completely off, the shock feels poppy. This is nothing like the 21 to 23 edition factory Fox Float X2. The first amateur 6-foot jump I did on this thing, it was like all over the place. So you're going to need to do a whole bunch of air pressure adjustments, clicker adjustments, if you're used to the 21 to 23 edition. I ended up retuning my fork, and I did start out with the precise same settings as the 21 to 23, and I will get into some of the details, not the exact official details of what's changed inside of the 24X2 to make it such a different shock. And no X2 video is complete without a little bit of frustration. The 24 one does not have the traction like before. But if you check out the Fox marketing stuff, there's a whole bunch of upgrades. And in my opinion, they're literally downgrades. So in this video, we're gonna find out why. And it was basically staring me in the face the entire time. And from what I've looked up, no one is talking about what's the big change in this shock. But anyway, this is the main seal head on the 24, and it has 2 O-rings inside, so that's one of the major reliability updates, so hopefully air doesn't get into the oil. This piece basically seals the oil within the shock. Fox calls it a bearing, but we'll call it a seal head. Now with the negative token removed from the X2, it's feeling like the older version. So those were a couple of the old videos on the 2024 Fox Float X2 Warranty Edition. So if you don't like the way your Warranty X2 rides, you can simply remove the negative token to get that plush feeling back. So here's the final hindsight on the X2 series. The best X2 to date is the 21 to 23 defective seal head with the negative token removed. So if you go back to my last video, it's a 30-minute documentary on the X2, and I actually love that shock, the defective version with the negative token out. Also, the 205/60 21 to 23 version doesn't have the negative token installed, and I thought it was a phenomenal shock. Briefing on the factory Fox Float X2. So I'm definitely going to give this 6 stars in the cool factor department because it is a very good looking shock. It's on every flagship mountain bike on the entire market, so there's no arguing that. even if you don't like Kashima coating like myself. The setup is 3 stars. Fox products are notoriously difficult to set up, not any more difficult than the Rockshox Vivid with all its new adjustments. We're getting 6 stars for the package suspension because the gold matches the fork. Like, there's no arguing that it's a pretty awesome package suspension from Fox. The performance, I'm going to say this is 4 stars in the big picture of all the shocks I've rode, 5 stars in the chunk, 3 stars in the blue flow rating. It's the reverse of the Rockshox Vivid. So I think I've covered this enough times. The 2024 one has some possible, you're watching a video on the internet, take it with a grain of salt, possible updated internals, some new valving, but it definitely has a massive negative token in the 2024 warranty edition. I think it's pretty terrible with the negative token installed. There is some benefits of the negative token. It kind of jumps better, feels more like a classic Rockshox product with a smaller negative chamber. The performance, we got that. The air spring, I'm going to give this 5 stars. It's a really good air spring as long as the negative token's removed. 3 stars, negative token in. It's slightly more friendly to heavyweight riders, but once again, I'm going to say I'm at the max weight of 220 pounds. So semi-friendly to heavyweight riders. The chassis is 6 stars. I think every single bicycle manufacturer on planet Earth designs their bikes around that shock. The damper, it's pretty good damper. I recently talked to someone, I'm not allowed to say names, who was not a huge fan of the X2 because they call it push-pull damping, and it's just basically like velocity damping. It's not speed sensitive or something. I still think it's really good damping. So the otter play score is definitely a little bit downgraded on the X2. I'm gonna give it 4 stars. It's not quite as playful as the Vivid, even though I prefer the Fox products. This is mostly, I would prefer the X2 because it's better in the chunk, and I'm kind of intermediate rider, so you got to take a lot of things into account when you are getting your next shock. I think this is the biggest question for most people. Am I going to go Fox or Rockshox? So let's jump into a 21 to 23 X2 versus the new Rockshox Vivid.
Rockshox suspension is for peasants, bro. I don't even know why you're testing that stuff out. Fox Float X2, you should probably buy 2 of those, bro.
The best shock is the one you have, so don't fall into the upgrade FOMO trap. Go buy a vacation, it lasts longer in your memory. This trail is at the upper limits of my intermediate skill level, and while that Rockshox Vivid is incredibly active on the blue flow trails, I feel substantially safer on the X2. And this trail is so chunky, I actually have the climb switch on the X2 to make it even slower moving and safer down this chunky trail. Now this trail is like a mix of tech and flow, and with the Fox 38 I feel substantially more confident because I feel like it just has more traction. But remember, this is a 21 to 23 one with the negative token removed. Reversing that around with the Rockshox Vivid and the 38, the Zeb on the front of the bike, it's a lot more nervous when I'm coming through the chunk. So intermediate riders, I would suggest you go for the more traction filled Fox suspension.
All right, bro, that was a steep section.
Diving back into the spreadsheet, the Rockshox Vivid gets 29 points, while the Fox Float X2 gets 35 points. But zooming down from 10,000 feet, I'm still going to say the Vivid is a better shock. The hydraulic bottom out is an incredible feature. Every shock should have this. It's better on mellow trails. We had a long development period, so there's no reliability on the Vivid. I would be more confident spending $700 on a Vivid, knowing the Fox Float X2 has been recalled like 9 different times, and this time they're not even recalling it. So let's jump into the all-mountain shocks. The DVO Topaz Prime. The 2025 DVO Topaz was a slight update from the original T3 compression adjuster. So this was the only shock that I got for free because I'm so good at offending people. Everyone I've ever talked to has basically ghosted me. But I'm okay with that because I like to buy and borrow stuff because that lets me basically act like an uncaged animal and just say whatever I want. So I do truly appreciate the DVO brand because these guys are cool and they do damping pretty darn good. Really nice touches on the DVO Topaz Prime with sag indicator, so when that guy disappears, that means 30% sag, exactly where this shock likes to ride. While this may be a super compact shock, the compression lever kind of sticks out. It may rub your leg or your bicycle, so double check fitment before getting one of these. My first ride on this was on the Specialized Kenevo 180mm DH e-bike. This isn't the best shock for that bike, but it is going to score pretty high on the Otter playlist. While the DVO Topaz isn't the best shock for my 180mm DH e-bike, I ripped it off of there and put it on the Specialized Status, which is the nice little jib bike, and it was definitely a better match. But I did have some serious complaints with the Topaz as far as the air can. So this thing is not friendly to heavyweight riders. You can put negative tokens in there, but it just kills the small bump sensitivity. So I ordered up the HV air can from the guys over at DVO, bolted it into the Rocky Mountain, and this was pretty darn impressive shock.
The other magic feature, this one has a bladder, the DVO has a bladder, and this one has a soft internal floating piston. So this just makes it more sensitive to the touch, hard to explain. So after riding all these air shocks, I used to love X2 and Vivid because they have big stanchions and I think they look cool. But in reality, a smaller stanchion is more reactive. So if you get the right air shock or the right coil shock, we have a 14mm stanchion and these things are incredibly responsive. So more insights later in this video.
Secret sauce number 2 is a smaller stanchion. They are more reactive, just like a bladder or a soft internal floating piston. But there's no exception for an excellent damper and air spring. So the reason the Manitou is better than the DVO is because it has a better air spring. Spreadsheeting the DVO Topaz Prime, I'm going to give this 3 stars in the cool factor department because green is the only option. It's a decisive color. When it comes to the setup, I'm going to give it 4 stars. It's a little tricky, but there's only a few clicks. The package suspension is absolutely excellent with 35, 36, 38. I'm only going to give the performance 4 stars, even though it has all the secret sauces involved, most likely due to the air spring not getting along with me. Getting into the air spring, it is a very difficult setup for the 220-pound rider. It's not heavyweight rider friendly. The chassis is small, but the compression lever sticks out, so you may have some issues on the DVO Topaz Prime. The previous one didn't have these issues. The damping is always excellent from DVO, so if you were 50 kilograms, 100 pounds, half of my weight with the HV air can, I would easily put this into 3rd place, but in the big picture of all weights of riders, it's got to go way down the list. So the Otter play factor is very high in the DVO Topaz at 5 stars. I do like this shock and actually gonna keep it as my backup shock. Giving credit where credit's due, the Cane Creek Kitsuma looks identical to the Vivid. And remember, the Kitsuma is 4 years older. So there's some kind of borrowing going on there. So I do truly appreciate the Cane Creek brand and I don't like to shit on them. But unfortunately, I'm gonna have to make that noise during this video because I'm not gonna just sell out to hopefully get a free shock. The adjusters on the Cane Creek Kitsuma are extremely disappointing. For the 2025 year, they have updated them, and hopefully they are better, because I am rooting for America here. Another disappointing factor in the Cane Creek Kitsuma is these tokens. They are not precise, and they're very difficult to set up, and they smell kind of funny, but maybe the shock's never been serviced, because I bought it off Facebook Marketplace. So it cavitating, don't hold it against this shock. I'm not sure if they cavitate or not. So the shock is a massive shock, not out of place on a DH bike. So Cane Creek needs to come out with a dual crown fork or a 38mm stanchion. And I did read a little things on the internet that they are coming out with one soon. So I'm not going to say the package suspension is total shit, but currently it is shit. As a long-term owner of the Cane Creek Double Barrel, the Kitsuma feels very familiar. These shocks are very active on the trail, so they're going to get a high score in the Otter fun factor. They really do have a lot of pop and play, but I hope you like to basically pull over on the side of the trail and twist the knobs and be somewhat of a tech nerd. Once you do get this shock dialed, if you are able to get it dialed, it is a really impressive experience. So I'm going to rate the performance on this shock exceptionally high, with the caveat of having to pull over about 9,000 different times and adjust those clickers without clicks. So remember, if you buy the new one, they did try to address this and make it simpler. I don't think I'm the only one out there in the market who struggled with Cane Creek adjusters. Debriefing on the Cane Creek Kitsuma. So I don't think it's a particularly cool shock. Maybe you like Cane Creek. We'll just put it right in the middle at 3 stars because it is a full DH shock, so I think it's kind of cool. The setup is very disappointing with a 1 star, but remember they did update this for the 2025 year to try to make it simpler. The package suspension is pretty disappointing. We don't have any kind of enduro DH kind of fork to go with this shock, and it has a very, very unique special feel. The performance, I'm going to rate it 5 stars. I thought it performed really good. Just has some serious setup concerns. The air spring is very similar in feel to the X2. So it's semi-friendly to heavyweight riders. That's a good thing. The chassis is 4 stars. It's literally, I think Rockshox borrowed the design attributes of it because they're virtually the same. So 4 stars because you could have some serious interference issues with your frame. I think the Cane Creek damping is a little bit primitive, poppet valve, push and pull style damping, not speed sensitive. And I think the Vivid is better than the Kitsuma Air because the Vivid has HBO. The HBO is clutch on the Vivid, and if you're a boomer, clutch means cool, I think. So the otter play factor is 5 stars. This is a non-internal floating piston design shock, but you do have to hear this. The Cane Creek Kitsuma has a bladder in style of the piggyback. This does not automatically mean it's good. It's also missing a small stanchion, but I personally feel like the damper was a little bit primitive, and not even mentioning how difficult it was to set this shock up. I do have a heavy bias towards the more enduro style shock, so I'm going to put this video on the screen. Marzochi Bomber versus Fox Float X2. So they are very different, and you'll find out why. The Marzochi Bomber Air and the Fox Float X look very similar. In this video, you are going to find out the truth. Riding and torn down on the bench, so let's go. I activated the damper on the $10,000 dyno tester from Harbor Freight. It takes about 55 to 59 pounds of pressure to get it into the travel, so we can assume they're going to have very similar small bump sensitivity. The Bomber Air has a sweeper adjust compression lever. It easily removes with a 2mm Allen key, and underneath the compression adjuster, we have a protruding rod. The FloatX compression needle is buried under this cover and buried in the shock. It has some more expensive machining because you can put balls, detents, and a low speed compression adjuster on it. This is an OEM edition RX Tune Specialized FloatX. So I have the $6 eBay knob, and I'm going to say it has about 2 clicks of low speed compression added from the factory. If you want to know the secret to the DHX or the Fox FloatX, you need to put 2 to 4 clicks of low speed compression and no more. The Bomber Air and the FloatX share the same travel reducers, these orange tabs on the bench. You can easily change the stroke on both shocks by removing the air can and a small torque bit. The service procedure for both the Bomber and the FloatX is virtually identical. We have shim stacks on the rebound main piston located inside of the stanchion. So on the top, according to the motorcycle library, would be the high speed rebound. On the bottom of the piston would be the low speed rebound. So I'm going to tear these shim stacks apart and see if they're different. Most of my education information is coming from the Motorcycle Suspension Bible. So here's the shim stacks controlling the rebound in the Bomber Air. It's a pretty sophisticated shim stack. We've got a whole bunch of shims. Now I can tell you from my experience taking dampers apart, the more shims a shock has, the better it's going to ride on the trail. For an example, the Suntour uses like 2 shims to control the compression, and it's pretty much garbage. So Fox is pretty good at controlling the oil flow, or aka damping. Now if you're a little bit of a beginner, here's what damping really looks like. It's a super simple form of controlling the oil flow. This isn't a huge surprise, they virtually have the same shim stack on the rebound on the lower part of the shock. The Bomber Air has one extra shim on the lower part of the piston, so I'm guessing, assuming I don't know, the Bomber's going to have a little bit slower of a rebound because it has an extra shim. I'm not a suspension scientist quite yet, but I do have quite a bit of experience. So let's take a look at the compression base valves inside the piggyback of both shocks. So on the left is the Fox Float X, and it has 3 large ports so it can flow more oil. On the right is the Bomber Air with smaller ports. So I'm thinking the Bomber Air is going to be more progressive, a harder compression tune straight out of the factory. So on top of that base valve we have a shim stack. And I was able to pull the shim stacks out, but I wasn't able to pull the piggyback off the Bomber Air because you need a specialty shaft clamp to remove the piggyback. So here's the compression shim stack in the Bomber Air. On the very bottom, it's not the most sophisticated shim stack on the compression side. It has like 9-10 shims total. A simple 12mm bolt holds those shims onto the base valve. Over here on the right is the shim stack for the compression on the Fox Float X. It is a much more sophisticated shim stack with a whole bunch of tiny shims right up against the base valve, and then a whole bunch of big shims. So like I told you, from my experience, the more shims, the better it's gonna feel on the trail. With the compression tunes out on the table, this is every possible configuration of shim stacks you can buy aftermarket. So if we take a look at the light and the medium base valve tune, it looks very similar to the Float X and the RX tune. Now I didn't measure everything, but I'm just kind of going off eye here. Scrolling through this list, I can't find any compression tune that matches the Bomber Air, so you're going to have to keep watching to find out later in this video how it does. If you want to put Fox Float X volume tokens in your Marzochi Bomber Air, you need to do this. Basically Dremel part of the token out so it clears the air filling valve. I did an experiment, put the Float X spacers in it, and destroyed an $80 shock pump, so learn this lesson from me. The last step will be recharging the IFP in both shocks. The Bomber Air repair manual calls for 150 psi, plus or minus 10. By lowering the IFP pressure 10 psi, you will get softer shock or more small bump sensitivity. Wrapping up the teardown section of this video. So the Bomber Air, everything on that shock is designed to be cheap, easy, and simple, and it's probably going to be more progressive. So here's the next challenge. I'm going to test both shocks on my e-bike, and the winner's going to stay on my Amish bike, because they kind of have the same suspension. So I'm definitely going to start out on the Bomber Air because it's a cooler shock. Like, let's just face it, Marzochi is definitely cool. So it takes about 260 psi to get 30% sag on the Bomber Air. And remember, it has that 0.7 token installed. The parking lot jump test will teach you a lot about how a shock's going to ride. And the Bomber Air feels maybe like I'm oversprung or it's more progressive. But I'm just going to carry on and see how it goes. So with any new suspension, I go off this 4-foot drop to set my bottom out control. Tells me how it's going to be on the big hit.
Oh, harsh.
So I've either got too much air pressure in the Bomber Air or I have the wrong token installed. So you can learn a lot about a shock's description. So when we take a look at the Bomber Air's description, the first thing that sticks out to me is this shock is DH rated. So it's definitely going to be more progressive than a trail shock. Progressive, like hard to bottom out, designed for massive big jumps. Now you can't have everything, you can't be DH progressive ready and trail friendly. And I'm definitely oversprung or have the wrong token in this shock, so the trail experience isn't exactly the best at this point.
So let's go to 260.
It is super vitally important that you have a digital shock pump if you want any measure of accurate suspension setup. So I dropped about 10 PSI out of the Bomber Air and continued on. I assumed the Bomber Air was going to be identical to the Floatex, so I have the same rebound 4 out of 10. And it is definitely not very poppy off the jumps, and I just have that same wall of resistance, so I definitely have the wrong token installed in the Bomber Air for my weight and riding style. The shock is completely dead and harsh. So going back to the shim stack on the Bomber Air, it has one additional shim on the rebound piston assembly. So this is effectively making the shock much slower rebound.
Okay, I moved the rebound. So we have 6 clicks.
So I moved the rebound 2 clicks faster and took it down one of my funner trails. And it was definitely more poppy and lively. So these shocks are vastly different just by one little shim inside of them. So I'm definitely have the wrong air token installed in the Bomber Air. So 0.6, 0.7 is not the magic token for the Bomber Air. It is the magic setup for every Floatex I've ever rode, and I've made half a dozen videos on the Floatex and 3 different shocks. The good news is the Bomber Air is superior to the Rockshox Super Deluxe, and it's a pretty decent shock overall.
Parking lot test.
The Floatex compression tune is substantially softer and more compliant. But like every new piece of suspension I get, I gotta go off a hook to flat to make sure I'm not gonna get a harsh bottom out later. I'm kind of on the upper limit of my bottom out control, so I probably need to add like 0.1 token to the 0.6 that's already in there. So the trail experience in the Floatex is absolutely outstanding. I actually made this video because I was so disappointed in the DHX. I was like, I've got to go get some Floatexes because the Floatex was my favorite shock of all trail time. And I was pleasantly surprised to remember this is the best trail shock you can get. The small bump sensitivity out of the Floatex is pretty outstanding for a little tiny trail shock. Now it's not like coil level or EXT level, but it's really good. The Floatex is really an outstanding all-arounder. I want you to watch the Floatex on this section. Its compression is absolutely perfect. It kind of hangs out in the mid-stroke waiting for your next pop and play. So let's dive into the shim stack for the compression on the Floatex. Remember, it's got a much more sophisticated shim stack for the compression, and it definitely feels more sophisticated when you're riding it. The Bomber Air has like 4 or 5 shims in it, and it feels just more progressive. So by simply looking at the product description for the Bomber Air, by it saying it's DH ready, it's just basically a more progressive shock. It's harder to bottom out. The low speed compression knob, the 3D printed one off eBay, is super easy to install, and I haven't had the best luck with it. But during that ride, I did figure out how to use it effectively and index it for the better. So adding a little bit of low speed compression to the Floatex will definitely enhance the ride. So what you do in your riding position, you want to reach down and turn it as much as you can from your riding position. This way it's kind of indexable because you can't turn it any more or any less from that position. And the winner is the boring OEM edition Fox Floatex RX tune. It is much better all around shock. If you do massive jumps and want a cheap shock, the Bomber Air, the Marzochi shock, is definitely better. There's one more benefit of the Bomber Air. You don't need to rip it open and put tokens inside because it's so progressive. My first ride with no tokens went pretty darn good. Fox Floatex, I'm going to give this a 4-star cool factor. Fox puts a lot of money into making this cool, and I think they did a semi-good job. 4-star setup, it's pretty easy to set up. They have nice little setup guides. All you can do is put 1 token in the thing. Package suspension, I feel like the Floatex matches the 36 like a glove. The performance of this shock is pretty darn good. The air spring could go 3 or 4 stars depending on how heavy you are. Even for me, I would rate this 4 stars, but it does start to get a little bit harsher with those higher pressures. The chassis is 4 stars. I think every bike in the universe can fit this. The damper, The shock works good, but I feel like Fox has some weird marketing rubbish behind not putting bottom out control on it. So I do got to downgrade the damper quite a bit, because every fork on the list so far has had high speed compression or some form of bottom out control. This is a shock I could live with because it has got a very high otter play factor. It jumps good, it jibs, it likes to move quickly because it has one ingredient in the secret sauce. The Marzochi Bomber, I'm going to give it 3 stars in the cool factor because it's just like a Harbor Freight Float X. The setup is definitely easier with 6 stars for the setup because we have a super heavy compression tune that does not need tokens and a sweeper lever that works super good for the low speed compression. The package suspension is rubbish. We got to actually downgrade this. It doesn't match the Super Z. And the new Z1 with the rail damper is absolute trash. So the package of the Marzochi is very disappointing from all angles. The performance, I'm going to say it's 3 stars. It works. The heavy compression tune is a little bit disappointing in my opinion. It just feels a little bit like a wall of resistance. It's the same air can as the Float X. Basically, it gets a little bit harsh with the higher pressures. The chassis, we're going to downgrade this because it's kind of crooked and looks stupid, but it's basically the same as the Float X. The damper is going to get downgraded because of the heavy compression tune. The otter play factor is once again 5 stars because it does have the secret sauce of a smaller stanchion. If I was like politically correct, which I'll never be, I would put Super Deluxe, Marzochi, Float X, and DVO into the like all mounting kind of category and then rank them all accordingly. But there's brands like Ohlins and Manitou that just skew the lines. So if someone asked me which all mountain-ish 150mm travel shock I would recommend them to, between the DVO and the Float X, it would be between those 2 shocks. But let me explain to you why I would choose this one. Heading into the bike park to answer that question. First run was on the DVO Topaz and I went through this high-speed section of Chunder. So the DVO Topaz Prime has an excellent high-speed compression circuit. That shock maintains its confidence or its stability during the chunk. Switching out shocks later in the day, I put the Float X into the bike. When things get a little bit on the faster, chunkier side, the Float X gets a little bit skittish. So both shocks are excellent, but DVO definitely does have the upper hand when it comes to damping. Coming in last place, we have the 23 to 24 Super Deluxe Ultimate. This shock is discontinued for the 2025 year. You can put a new piston in this one and like a new piggyback that's worth way more than the shock is worth, so I wasn't going to do that. I want to make a very valid point here. Just because we have a high-speed compression adjuster does not mean this is a good shock. This is a very primitive poppet valve damping style, and it honestly is just complete rubbish. But I do want to make a very good point. The low performance equals out to extreme reliability. You can go years without servicing these and they'll still ride absolutely fine. So I have the Super Deluxe Ultimate with the linear air can. So I actually had to dig into YouTube and watch my own video to re-educate myself about linear and progressive air cans, because Rockshox really dropped the ball when it came to the air can variation in this year's of shocks. They now have the XL can, like one can, which makes sense. Newer second generation Super Deluxe, you're not allowed to use the Nardog token. You have to use those tiny little purple tokens, and you can only put like 2 or 3 of them in, and it's an absolute nightmare. I ended up putting the Nardog token in there and it does fit, but it could cause damage to your shock. The low quality damping doesn't end with the high speed compression damping. The low speed is also very primitive as well, and each click is like too much of an adjustment. There's actually companies out there making products to fine tune the low speed compression. This is the linear air can that goes on progressive bikes, and then you couldn't get the progressive air can for months, so I ordered one from Europe, Ukraine, and then I put the progressive one on and it was too big of a negative chamber. Debriefing on the Super Deluxe Ultimate. Remember, this is the discontinued 23 to 24 edition, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it. The cool factor, I'm going to say it's 2 stars. It's a discontinued shock, and Super Deluxes were never very cool. The setup is incredibly challenging because the clicks, the primitive damping, the limited amount of tokens. That's why I put this into last place. The package suspension is decent. Kind of matches up to the Zeb, kind of matches up to the Lyric. That's up to you to interpret. I don't think it matches anything very good, so 4 stars. The performance, if you can get the progressive air can or the XL air can and get it set up right, is halfway decent. It's really not that far off of the Floadex, but it's just incredibly hard to get there. The air spring, I'm going to give this 1 stars. I think they're on their 3rd try with the air spring. It's a real disappointment. The chassis, there's nothing special about it, nothing really bad about it, so 3 stars. The damper is very primitive, but remember it does have increased reliability.